The name John List might not immediately ring a bell today, but he was a highly feared and notorious criminal who captured the American populace's imagination in the 1980s. So much so that a franchise of cult slasher films were based on his horrendous deeds. Today on Scream to Screen, we're going to explore how serial killer John List inspired The Stepfather. But before we do that, be sure to subscribe to Graveyard Shift and let us know in the comments which true-life horror stories you'd like for us to cover next. John Emil List was born in Bay City, Michigan. He was an only child and raised devout Lutheran. However, this religious background did not prevent him from succumbing to his inner demons. Quite the opposite, in fact. Before List was an internationally recognized visage of fear, he was a normal man. In 1943, he enlisted in the United States Army and served as a lab technician during the Second World War. After his discharge, he enrolled in the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, where he earned a bachelor's degree in business administration and a later master's degree in accounting. He eventually settled into an idyllic suburban life, complete with a wife and children. But John constantly felt that his life was lacking. It was this feeling that spurred him to contemplate doing things, dark things, horrific things. John List was about to carry out one of the most brutal familial slayings in modern times. His motivation is nearly as incomprehensible as the level of cruelty on display. On November 9, 1971, List took the life of his entire immediate family. In a sadistic show of cold antipathy, List systematically put down his wife, mother, daughter, and youngest son with a 9mm Steyr semi-automatic handgun. Then, in an even more grotesque and heartless move, he made himself lunch and sat down for a quiet meal, still drenched in blood from the act. Afterwards, List went to watch his oldest son, Junior, play in a soccer game. He stayed for the entire match and cheered his child on from the sidelines like any other parent. But upon driving Junior back to the house, he repeatedly fired his weapon into the boy's body, snuffing him out simply and dispassionately. Knowing that the authorities would soon be pursuing him, List took a train from his home state, New Jersey, to Michigan. After disembarking, he had a bad feeling about the place and decided to continue his journey to Colorado. The remains of his family were not uncovered for close to a month. The antisocial and reclusive nature of the Lists contributed to the lengthy time span. Ultimately, he settled in Denver in 1972. He took an accounting job under the name of Robert Peter Bob Clark, a name derived from that of a middle school classmate. He lived a quiet life, worked, and kept mostly to himself. From 1979 to 1986, he was a controller at a paperbox manufacturer just outside Denver. Later, he joined a Lutheran church that ran a carpool service for congregation members. He met Dolores Miller in 1985, and, unfortunately for her, the two quickly fell in love. Wedding bells followed soon after, and they lived in romantic bliss, albeit with a dark secret lurking over their picture-perfect matrimony. John List was purveyor of mass carnage, and his loved ones had no idea what had befallen his previous extended family. It was in 1989 that the Fox television program America's Most Wanted aired an episode that chronicled the crimes carried out by List. In the episode, which was a massive cultural touchstone for Americans from all walks of life, the producers used a clay bust depiction of what List was projected to look like. This age sculpture, created by forensic artist Frank Bender, was repeatedly shown on the show, in the hopes that someone in List's life would realize his past offenses. Shockingly, this artistic representation turned out to be highly accurate. On June 1st, less than 2 weeks after the broadcast, List was arrested at a Richmond accounting firm. This happened after a Denver neighbor recognized Fox's description as the spitting image of the quiet man they had come to know, and rapidly alerted authorities. List was soon extradited back to New Jersey, where he was held by authorities and questioned. He initially refused to admit any wrongdoing and was held in custody for close to 3 months. Eventually, the buildup of military records, fingerprint matches, and crime scene evidence became overwhelming, forcing him to make a full and exhaustive confession on February 16, 1990. List's crimes had taken on a life of their own. The idea of living with someone who had been such a different person in a metaphorical previous life captured the imaginations of Americans of all ages. In 1993, John List's horrific crimes were adapted to the small screen in a made-for-television crime drama directed by Bobby Roth and starring Robert Blake and Beverly D'Angelo. Titled Judgment Day: The John List Story, it was well-received and ultimately garnered an Emmy nomination. The bizarre irony that Robert Blake, who also had his own run-ins with the law and accusations of murder, played List as a chilling wrinkle to the story. The film depicts a fictional version of the crimes that List engaged in, then chronicles the character's inner turmoil as he spends 17 years on the run. It aired on CBS on February 23, 1993, and had a total running time of 96 minutes. However, this adaptation was a mere pit stop on the way to the film that most people regard as the definitive interpretation of John List's malice. The most famous version of List's story was created by acclaimed crime novelist Donald Westlake, who reached international superstardom writing under the pseudonym Richard Stark, the author of the Parker novels. 1987 saw the release of The Stepfather, a psychological thriller directed by Joseph Rubin, written by Westlake and starring Terry O'Quinn. O'Quinn stars as Jerry Blake, aka Henry Morrison, aka Bill Hodgkins in the film, a serial killer who adopts fake identities, integrates himself into families, and then commits various atrocities. Loosely based on the at-the-time unsolved List murders, the film is a brooding character study. The film follows O'Quinn's character as he begins the process of assuming a new identity. Shortly after, he develops an obsession with his newfound stepdaughter, and then must combat her as she becomes suspicious of his true motives. The film is loosely based on the life of John List, but the plot utilizes plenty of tropes commonly associated with the slasher films that were popular at the time. Despite being billed as horror, a genre that is often overlooked, The Stepfather solidified its legacy thanks to an impressive cast, a delicately balanced screenplay, and clear direction. Additionally, the film is much more of a psychological drama than a typical schlock and shock genre retreat, chronicling the inner turmoil and bizarre compulsions of its protagonist in a fascinating character study. The Stepfather is highly regarded in both cult film circles and horror circles due to its unique tone that balances genuine performances with shocking twists. The film was released theatrically on January 23, 1987, and grossed $2.5 million at the box office. It was very well received by critics, especially considering that the slasher craze was in full effect and very looked down upon at the time. In a sea of sameness, Westlake's brilliant interpersonal drama was a refreshing take on the tired trope of the genre. The Stepfather 2, also known as Stepfather 2: Make Room for Daddy, was released in 1989. This psychological thriller was directed by Jeff Bird and written by John Arbach. The sequel came 2 years after the first film's success, and the cast includes such standouts as Caroline Williams and a young Meg Foster. Despite the seemingly definitive ending in the original film, Terry O'Quinn reprises his role as John List-inspired serial killer Jerry Blake. The character survives a gunshot wound and a stabbing, and then is ultimately institutionalized in Puget Sound, Washington. From here, he does what any self-respecting horror movie slasher does. He escapes and finds a new family to terrorize. While the script by John Arbach and the direction by Jeff Burr aren't bad, the sequel itself pales in comparison to the diamond in the rough that was the first film. The only real standout in this film is the fact that Terry O'Quinn is obviously having a ball as the insidious protagonist. One of the common complaints about the second film is that it deviates from the subtle tone of the first. After test screenings, studio executives Harvey and Bob Weinstein asked for reshoots to be conducted, making the film bloodier and more in line with what would be expected from a slasher film. Jeff Burr refused, and a second director, Doug Campbell, was hired to do reshoots. Burr commented on the situation in an interview. They cut a little bit of the film out and they added some badly done blood effects. Really badly done because Terry O'Quinn refused to do it as well. Really? They were meaningless. So that was irritating. Although it was originally intended to be just a direct-video sequel, Stepfather 2 was ultimately given a limited release in theaters. This was because the Weinsteins were impressed with the quality of the final cut and decided that the film would be a prime candidate for theatrical release. Premiering in November of 1989, it grossed $1.5 million domestically at the box office. After a few years' respite from the franchise, on June 4, 1992, The Stepfather 3: Father's Day was released as a TV movie. Written by Guy Mager and Mark B. Ray, and directed by Guy Mager, the film picks up right where the last left off. After being reinstitutionalized, Our favorite homewrecker, this time being played by Robert Reitman, escapes yet again and has his face altered with plastic surgery, and then does what the Stepfather does. Stepfather 3 is not remembered well by fans of the franchise. It is a low-budget retreat of the greatest hits from the prior two films. Additionally, Terry O'Quinn's absence is felt throughout the entire picture. Filmed on a budget of $1.8 million across 25 days in Los Angeles, the film had a very cheap and rushed feel to it. One notable aspect of the production was that Meagher filmed an actual plastic surgery procedure during the sequence where Jerry Blake undergoes facial reconstruction. There were no special effects used during the scene at all. But even that gruesome, exploitative element couldn't save a film that just completely falters at every turn. It was not a major rating success, and no future installments were planned in its wake. Entertainment Weekly's Doug Broad gave the film a D+, referring to it as a poorly scripted, all-too-familiar chiller, and saying that Robert Reitman's performance was robotic. For the Stepfather franchise, this was the end for close to 20 years. That is, until 2009, when a remake of The Stepfather, directed by Nelson McCormick and written by J.S. Cardone, was produced. This version of the story featured Nip Tuck's Dylan Walsh in the lead role. He delivers a rather sinister performance as Grady Edwards, aka David Harris, aka Chris Ames. Released at the height of the horror remake trend, the film was distributed by Screen Gems, and largely follows a similar structure to the first film. However, much of the subtle and dark themes were lost in favor of overt attempts at horror. The film grossed $29.1 million in North America and $31.2 million worldwide. Despite being financially successful, it was reviewed very poorly, receiving an 11% on Rotten Tomatoes. Reportedly, Terry O'Quinn was approached to make a cameo in the film, but declined. Ultimately, John List died in prison in 2008. He is remembered as a diabolical madman who lived as a free citizen for close to 17 years after committing multiple atrocities. Still, the films based on his life have a fervent and dedicated cult following, which would lead us to ask the inevitable question: is that a good thing? So what do you think? Did John List evade capture for so long due to his keen intellect? Was he just lucky? Do you fully know your partner well enough to say that they're not someone like List? Let us know in the comments below, if you have the courage. And as always, like, comment, and subscribe for more videos like this from The Graveyard Shift.